Hey, welcome back to Pop Culture Graveyard. I am Hollis, and this week I'm going to talk a little bit about the new release from Third Man Records, which is the Stooges live at the Goose Lake International Music Festival, the tapes of which were lost for 50 years. This happened back in 1970, and it's famous amongst hardcore Stooges fans for being the very last time the original four Stooges played together on stage. Right after this set, Iggy Pop unceremoniously fired Dave Alexander, or Xander, the bass player. So I'm going to give you my take on this album, as well as a bit of an overview on the original Stooges albums. James Williamson? Never heard of him. Look out. Alright, so before we get all the way to August of 1970 at Goose Lake, I think we should start back in August of 1969 when the Stooges released The Stooges, self-titled debut album by Iggy Pop on vocals, the Ashton brothers, Ron and Scott, on guitar and drums, respectively, and Dave Alexander, or Xander, on bass. This is the Rhino 180-gram release. You cannot go wrong with this. This is such a good album, produced by John Cale. This is the primordial sludge from which the later Stooges would emerge. It's a very basic album. There's a lot of psychedelic guitar on it from Ron Ashton, who was an underrated, unheralded guitarist who really was the magic in the early Stooges musical formula. He came up with the bulk of the riffs. He was very influenced by jazz players as much as other rock players. He had that high energy Detroit sound that their contemporaries and friends, the MC5, had put a stamp on by now. Rock Action was a powerful drummer with a bit of a tribal beat. He almost sounded like he was beating his drums into submission. Iggy Pop taught him a few things because Iggy was a drummer. He was a strong player. He got more melodic the further he went. Dave Alexander, or Xander, on bass. Xander was a very basic player to start out with because he came a little late to the party. He would help the Stooges in a roadie capacity back when the band originally started as the Psychedelic Stooges, using things on stage like blenders and vacuum cleaners that they would hold up to the mic. Ron was playing bass and Iggy was trying to play guitar, and then Iggy decided that he wanted a proper lineup, and so Xander joined on bass, and the original Stooges were formed. Iggy Pop, obscured here by the hype sticker, was one of the most electrifying performers of the day. Obviously, he still is. But there was something about these Stooges that was quaint and charming and sweet. And I think the sweetness emanates from the Ashton brothers and their goofy friend Xander. This was very much a band of brothers in the beginning. The OG Stooges were all from the same area. They all knew the same people. And when they got to make this album in New York, they were all super excited because there were a bunch of Michigan boys who'd never really seen much, and suddenly they're in Times Square back in the bad old days. So they were very excited. They were glad to work with John Cale, who Iggy had gotten to know a little bit by then. I Want to Be Your Dog is a great track even today. If you're not familiar with it, I don't know where you've been, but you're long overdue to hear it. John Cale plays piano, a one-note riff, and sleigh bells on I Want to Be Your Dog to flesh out the sound a little more. 1969 was based around a riff that Ron came up with on the best day of his young life. It was a day when he first lost his virginity, he dropped acid for the first time, and he heard the Byrds album, the notorious Byrd Brothers, for the first time. And on that Byrds album, there's a track called Tribal Gathering. It's a really sweet, soft, melodic track. Then at about 50 seconds in, this guitar comes out of nowhere and just sort of plays this two-note riff over and over and over again. Ron took that riff and built an entire song out of it, 1969. When the band first arrived in New York to cut the record, they had about 5 songs, and they were very excited, and they played those 5 songs. And each song was about 2 minutes long. Then they had like a 5-minute extended jam on the end of it. Holtzman, the head of Elektra Records, heard them, and he was like, no. you guys need to write more songs. And so they lied and they were like, we got more songs. So he's like, great, you got a week to get them all down. So within that week, the Stooges banged out 5 other songs. Ron came up with Real Cool Time, Not Right, and Little Doll. Iggy came up with an old Stooges song that they'd thrown away already, called Anne. And Xander came up with We Will Fall, which is based around this yoga chant he used to do, which I think is vastly underrated. It's a 10-minute track. It's clearly here only to fill out the album, but those 10 minutes stay true to the message of the Stooges. It's a very simple, repetitive, droning oddity, and that's what they were all about. And it was also done during a time when a lot of bands had one super long song on an album. So it's not really out of place. The entire album is so basic that it aged really well. The songs on here appeal to everyone. People who just are bored and have nothing to do, people who want to have a real cool time, and people who want to be your dog. This is a raucous affair, but given what's to come, in retrospect, this seems tame. Incidentally, John Cale's initial mix, sometimes called the closet mix, was rejected by the record company. So Jac Holtzman from Elektra Records and Iggy Pop went in themselves and remixed the album. So that's really the final mix you're hearing. The band were ahead of their time, and better things were to come. So in July of 1970, the Stooges released their masterpiece, Funhouse. This album is a perfect album. This pressing, by the way, is by Newbury Comics. Just wanted to show you a couple of different pressings. There were 1,500 of this one made with red and black vinyl, sunburst vinyl. You ready for the smoke show? This was produced by Don Gallucci. He started out in a band called Don and the Good Times, and Iggy was thrilled because he actually saw him on TV playing on Bandstand with his band back in the day. So they were very happy to work with him. Apparently he was a fun guy, played a mean keyboard, and he captured magic here. This album starts out strong with Down on the Street, which has some real Detroit swagger. It sounds like it came from an automotive town. It's really propulsive, it's gritty, and it grabs you. It's followed by a track called Loose, which is Iggy's sexy single entendre about how he wants to stick it deep inside. Because he's loose. You give him a break, the guy's loose. Incidentally, the album was supposed to lead off with Loose. That was supposed to be the first track, but Elektra Records didn't think that that sequence worked. They wanted to kick off the album with Down on the Street, so that's what you have here. But during live gigs of the day, they would play the album sequence the way they originally envisioned it, with Loose being the lead-off track. This album has a great track called 1970, which picks up where the previous album's track 1969 left off. It's a riff with real Bo Diddley action, and it's sort of 1969 on steroids. It's the burly older brother of that track, and the song is basically about how Iggy feels all right. So it's a great track, it really kicks ass. And then about 3 minutes into the song, you're like, all right, this was a great song. I think I know everywhere that it's gone. And then at 3 minutes and 31 seconds, Steve McKay jumps in on saxophone and tears it up. And then you're like, I have no idea where this track is going. And Steve McKay plays from that point on the rest of the album. The following 2 tracks, Funhouse and LA Blues, is a real showcase for Steve's sax. The track Funhouse, named after the place where the band all lived and rehearsed and performed and recorded and did all sorts of stuff, is a tour de force for the band. It's a real departure from all the tracks that come before it. And Xander's bass on that is the funkiest. Stank? Funk. Funky. So in the track, Iggy is screaming a number of things. One of them is, blow, Steve! Impelling Steve to blow his sax even harder. Just so you know, when they were recording, Iggy Pop gave Steve the instructions, I want you to sound like Maceo Parker on acid. Mission accomplished. And LA Blues is the only way this album could end. It just tears down everything that they built up on the previous tracks. But it's such sexy destruction. It is a freak out. It's one of the old high energy freakouts like the MC5 used to do. That was the only way this album could end. Incidentally, the last 3 tracks on this album, 1970, Funhouse, and LA Blues, were pressed onto a side of a record from the U.S. Armed Services that were sent over to the boys in Vietnam. So could you imagine being out in the filth, fighting for every inch against Charlie, and someone drops LA Blues and Funhouse on you? You want to know why that war didn't go well? This record isn't about Vietnam. This record is Vietnam. The song TVI is an outrageously great Ron Asheton performance on guitar. It's his finest riff in a sea of stellar riffs. Ron tears up his guitar in that track. The rhythm section propelled the song further, but my God, when the song drops out and then that riff starts up again, it's all you need to hear from the Stooges. There's a reason they used it in Velvet Goldmine for that fake-ass band. It always works. If there's a highlight for Dave Alexander on this album, it's the track Dirt. It is a smooth, sexy, funky, bass-heavy track. It's the track on which the Stooges grow up and turn sexy. And Dave's rubbery bass leads the way. The lyrics are dirty and downbeat, but they're oblique enough that they're sexy and poetic at the same time. Dirt is the Stooges' greatest slow song. It is rare for a heavy band to play a slow song and not lose any of their energy or power. Dirt is that track. So as I said, this album is their masterpiece, and they would soon go out on the road and play dates. Incidentally, I got this Best of the Funhouse Sessions bootleg about 20 years ago now. I think it's an Italian bootleg. I think Don Gallucci was involved. It's credited to the Stooges, and it's alternate takes, and they chose wisely. So one disc. I don't really need the 10 discs of the new set that's come out. I think that's overkill. And I love the Stooges, and I love Funhouse. But, man, you know how you told us that being a writer is all about making choices? Well, it just seems like you didn't make any, Grady. So Funhouse was released in July of 1970, and the band immediately went out on the road to promote, and on August 8th, 1970, they performed at the Goose Lake International Music Festival in Jackson, Michigan. Goose Lake was Detroit's answer to Woodstock. Anywhere between 100,000 to 200,000 people showed up. It was fenced in. People were calling it Goose Lake Penitentiary because once you got in, you couldn't get out. But it was 1,000 times better run than Woodstock. A lot of the people behind the scenes running things had been in the music business for years. There were plenty of bathrooms. There was plenty of fresh water. There were medical tents. There were arts and crafts. There was plenty of food. People were not killing each other. A lot of big bands of the day played. Alice Cooper, the James Gang, Chicago, 10 Years After, Mountain, Joe Cocker, Jethro fucking Tull. So it was a scene, man. The promoters at this concert had even built a state-of-the-art stage. It rotated so that one band could be on playing while another band was setting up in the back. Then when it would rotate, the second band would break into their set while the other band was breaking down. So people didn't have to wait hours between sets. And the manager of the Grande Ballroom, who was working with all the bands, ensured that they went on time. So there was none of that stuff that went on at Woodstock, where somebody's supposed to go on at 9 and you don't see them until dawn. This was a well-run festival. If there was one problem this festival had, however, it is that there was a drug going around that was knocking people out. Some people were told it was coke, other people were told it was heroin, other people were told it was speed. In retrospect, people think that it was some sort of horse tranquilizer. And it took people out. Performers, concert goers, backstage people, a couple of the staff working there. Anybody got any horse tranquilizer? And this is where the Stooges enter the story. Iggy Pop and the boys were backstage. Dave Alexander was already drunk because he was a very shy, nervous person, and he needed a whole case of beer to even be able to get up on stage in front of that many people. So he didn't exactly start out in the best of shape. Someone came up to the band holding a bag with a straw in it and said, "Here, I have some." You don't have to ask the Stooges twice. 3 of the Stooges imbibed, everyone but Ron, who never took any drugs after that beautiful acid trip. After a little while, the drugs kicked in and the band was out. Iggy Pop was incoherent, Scott Ashton wasn't moving much, and Dave Alexander was zonked out of his mind. But by the time Showtime came around, Scott Ashton had kind of gotten back to normal because he was a big guy and he had a strong constitution. Iggy Pop, who's Iggy Pop, had been able to talk himself into a frenzy and get himself out on the stage and become somewhat coherent by then. Ironically, I think a couple of years later, Iggy's tour writer called for a horse tranquilizer. But poor Xander had a horrible constitution, and he was a little guy, and he was still messed the hell up. So for those of you who aren't hardcore Stooges fans, this has been a legendary night in Stooges lore. Supposedly, Dave Alexander was so messed up on drugs that he could not even play his bass. The stories are that he was almost like Syd Barrett in the final days of the Floyd, where he would stand on stage like a statue, not even touching his instrument. That sounded dirty. Every time Iggy Pop would tell the story, Xander was in worse and worse shape, thanks to a sound engineer, James Casserly, who was taping at the soundboard for God knows what reason. We have the concert finally, and it sounds amazing. For Stooges fans, any new bootleg is a godsend, and we are used to listening to crap, muddy, horrible things. Just to show you how rare that Stooges stuff was, I have been subsisting for years on subpar videotapes in which you have all manner of horrible recordings. I have them at Goose Lake Park in 1970, but the audio is horrendous. Back in the years when I got this, if you had told me that one day you'll have a pristine sounding version of that concert, I would have thought you were full of crap, man. Grainy VHS, that's what we get as Stooges fans. Sometimes listening to a Stooges bootleg, you almost feel like you're one of those FBI guys who's like, can you bring down the background noise a little? I hear a train whistle and a bell in the distance. Can you eliminate that? This is crystal clear. That alone makes this a grail. But the fact that we have an answer to the question, did Dave play his bass or not? Was it as bad as Iggy says? Is amazing. The answer is, Dave plays his bass. And sometimes he's quite good. And sometimes he's sloppy. And a couple of times he just plain loses it. But he's there. He was not missing in action. He's there. The way Iggy described it, there's a wall of sound behind him, and then suddenly there's not. And suddenly Iggy feels naked on stage, and he's pissed. And Dave doesn't play a note after that. That's not what happened. So the band opened with Loose, which they had intended to be their album opener, as I said earlier. And Dave is there. He's sloppy, but he's there. And the track works because Ron Ashton, God bless him, doesn't do drugs. And they sound amazing. Great opening track to kick off a concert. Second track, Down on the Street. Iggy's vocals are the problem for me. They go out a couple of times. And I know he's pissed at Dave, because Dave here does miss some changes. And he kind of just stops for a few seconds to catch his breath, I'd imagine. Maybe to do a little pig tranquilizer. And this is a track where Iggy is screaming, "No walls." You can tell Iggy's pissed. He, you know that sound of Iggy smacking the microphone on his hip that he would do sometimes? That was him super pissed at Dave. In TVI, Xander drops out a bit, but not so much that you'd notice. Besides, Ron carries that song, and the rhythm drops out during the song even, so people might not even know that it was supposed to be there. In the extemporaneous part where Iggy is singing, he again screams "No walls" from Down on the Street, which would get him in trouble with the promoters after the show when they wanted him arrested because they thought he was screaming for them to tear down the walls, which he was. Luckily, the band manager was there. He had a copy of the Stooges record. He put it on to that track, and they could hear that "No Walls" is actually on the song, and the cops left, and they didn't arrest him. Anyway, by the time the band played Dirt, Dave is awake. And thank God, because Dirt is the bass-led song. And if Dave wasn't working by then, they would have had to cut the concert short. Dave kills it on Dirt. Dave is there for the most important song that needs him there. and it's really, really a good rendition. In 1970, Dave is really waking up, and he's part of the band now. He may miss a change or two, but Dave is roaring back. With Steve McKay joining the band on Funhouse, Dave is in total control. It's his best song. Dave is on the money in this, and I really think that it's their best track that day. It's funky as hell, and Dave redeems himself. They end it with LA Blues, and by the time the power is pulled, you don't even notice, because it seems like such a natural ending to that song. And what I really like, even though it's low, is you can hear the audience applause. They went over great. The audience loved it. The audience didn't know there was anything wrong. Even people who had seen the Stooges before didn't see from the side of the stage anything wrong. Ron Ashton thought it was a great gig. Then they get backstage, and Iggy makes a beeline for Xander and fires him. Now, Iggy never liked Xander. He was a friend of the Ashtons. And I think he was just biding his time. Because, Dave would go off with his girlfriend. He'd miss a practice here or practice there. He was drunk sometimes. But this is Iggy Pop firing somebody for drugs. You know you have a problem when Iggy Pop is firing you for drugs. Where you at, Steven Adler? So Iggy immediately fires Dave. Then he goes up to the Ashton brothers and he says, and I don't want to hear anything out of you. I don't want to hear a word out of you. This is it. I've made up my mind. And I really think at that moment, if the Ashton brothers had stood up for Dave and been like, whoa, you were fucked up too. That's some bullshit. I think Iggy would have caved because they had just released their album. They were just starting to tour it. I think Iggy needed the band as much as the band needed Iggy at that point. And I think Iggy might have caved, especially the next day. But we'll never know. Iggy had a much stronger personality than the Ashton brothers. Iggy has even admitted, in retrospect, that taking one piece away from a band like that changed the whole dynamic. And thus began the revolving door of people in the Stooges. They got Zeke Zettner, a roadie, to play bass on the following gigs. Then they added a second guitarist, Bill Cheatham, to flesh out the sound. Bill Cheatham left. They got in Jimmy Recca, and they got in James Williamson, and the band was never really the same. So this was the end of the Stooges. It's very rare we have a recording of a legendary band's final concert. But we do for the Stooges. Not only that, but we have it twice. We have the original Stooges final gig, and then we have the later Iggy and the Stooges final gig on Metallica. I'm going to talk about Iggy and the Stooges in a future episode. But I just wanted to detail the death of the original OG Stooges, the core four that brought you the first two albums. I think there's been some revisionist history, and I think the importance of the Ashton brothers and Dave Alexander have been understated to an alarming degree by Iggy and others. And so I just wanted to right the ship a little bit and talk about them and how great they were. I have to say, Third Man did a great job with this pressing. It's very cleaned up. It helps that they started with a soundboard recording. My vinyl was flat, centered, and plays dead quiet. It's a beautiful pressing. I was a little worried because new releases, I'm always worried, but it has not left my turntable since I got it. It just keeps sounding better and better to me. So they did a good job. And I enjoy the liner notes as well. The concert, what went on there, people's remembrances of the day. It comes in a paper sleeve. I gotta say a little something that's long overdue. Paper sleeves have got to be through. Other than that, stellar release. And I highly recommend this to anyone who's ever bought a Stooges bootleg. This is just for us, really. They even let the in-between song noises happen. This is the full tape. It's not like they edited it down or remixed it for you. This is what you'd hear if you were at Goose Lake and you had a really prime spot when the Stooges played. So kudos to Third Man for a job well done. If you want to see the boys perform while you listen to this album, I highly recommend this book. Beautiful photographs in here, including such lovely things as Iggy pouring candle wax all over himself, choking himself with the microphone cord, all the hits. He's playing all the hits. This was the band of OG Stooges firing on all cylinders when it looked like they might take over the world. The world being 50,000 copies sold of their album, maybe. But it's a really nice memento of the band, a snapshot of the band at that time. For an overall biography, I highly recommend this illustrated biography. It's got a lot on the Stooges from the beginning to the very end when they reformed. But it's also got great stuff on the Funhouse sessions and a lot of great stories. Incidentally, the Stooges font is my second favorite font of all time after Planet of the Apes. And finally, there's Total Chaos, the story of the Stooges. This was put out by Third Man Books, a wing of the Third Man record company that put out the Goose Lake album. And it's fantastic. It's basically told by Iggy Pop. He's being interviewed throughout the whole book. The guy is showing him flyers and royalty receipts and concert stubs and obscure pictures and autographs and all sorts of things, and Iggy Pop is telling stories about it and commenting on it. Here is the Goose Lake Festival poster showing the full lineup, but this is an excellent book. In this book again, Iggy speaks of his remembrances of Dave Alexander on bass at the Goose Lake Festival, which would be proved wrong given this new pressing. So if you really want to hear Iggy's side of things, get this book. If you enjoyed this, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, and join me next week because I'll have some more cool stuff.